Good afternoon. This is Mary Miller, and I'm a volunteer with the Library of Congress, and I'm here today with Thomas Young. Today's date is August 25th, and we are doing an interview via Zoom. Thank you so much today for joining us, Thomas. Really pleased to meet you, and we're excited to hear your story and add it to the National Collection.
You're quite welcome. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for all you're doing.
Yeah. Let's start first with what branch of service you entered and why you chose that branch.
I served in the Air National Guard. I first enlisted in the Maryland Air National Guard in 1992. A few years later, I transferred to the West Virginia Air National Guard, to the 167th Airlift Wing based at Martinsburg, West Virginia. And I served in that unit until I retired in 2013. So I served a total of 20 and a half years. And for almost all of that time, I was a flight engineer on C-130s and C-5s. And I retired as a senior master sergeant.
Great. And where are you from? Where were you born?
I'm originally from North Carolina. I grew up on a tobacco farm in North Carolina, and I grew up hearing my grandfather's stories from World War II. He was a mechanic on B-17 Flying Fortresses in the legendary 8th Air Force. So his stories, his experience have a lot to do with why I decided to join the Air Force.
Sure.
The Air National Guard.
And can you tell me the names of your parents, what were their occupations, and whether or not they had any military background? And maybe we'll go on back, and just since you talked about your grandfather, were there any other key instrumental family members who had served?
My parents did not serve. My mother's name is Harriet Daniel Young, and she still lives on the farm in North Carolina. Sadly, my father has passed away. His full name was Bobby Wade Young. He was a farmer and a farm equipment dealer, and we lost him in 2019.
Great. Sorry to hear that. Can you tell me about what your family thought when you told them that you were going to be joining the Air Force?
They were surprised. I made a fairly late decision to join the Air National Guard. I had a career as a journalist, and I've always had this strange double career in aviation and then writing and journalism. When I was in high school, deciding what to study in college, I was torn between pursuing an active duty military career and pursuing journalism. I was very interested in writing and in the news business, and was also interested in flying, although at that point in my life, I'd never flown in an airplane, not even as a passenger. And in my youthful ignorance, I thought I had to choose one or the other and never look back. So for a long time, I pursued journalism pretty single-mindedly. I went to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, studied communication there, eventually got a job with the Associated Press. I was with the AP for 10 years.
Wow.
And in a strange way, my work at the AP helped lead me to the Air National Guard. Because I remember we covered the first Gulf War in the early 90s. And you'll recall when Saddam Hussein went into Kuwait, that was the start of Operation Desert Shield, which became Operation Desert Storm. And that was the first time since the Korean War that Guard and Reserve forces had been activated and deployed in large numbers. We've fought the Vietnam War almost exclusively with regular active duty forces. But in the time since the Vietnam War, the military had been reconfigured to the point where you couldn't really go to war without activating the Guard and Reserve, because so much capability had been transferred into the Guard and Reserve. So at the AP, of course, we covered all this. And we didn't just cover the facts and figures. We did a lot of what I thought were very interesting human interest stories about the individuals who were getting called up. And I thought these stories were fascinating, with these people who had these double lives. And by double life, I mean that in a good way. They had their civilian life and their civilian career, and yet they were also pursuing a military career. I remember one individual was a successful attorney, but he was also a senior NCO in a Marine Corps Reserve unit. I believe it was an armored unit. And he was all gung-ho about going and doing his job as a Marine. I remember another person we profiled was a state senator from somewhere in the Midwest. Perhaps it was Indiana. It's been so long, I'm not sure. But he was also a fighter pilot in the Air National Guard. Of course, his call sign was Senator. I thought that was the coolest thing in the world. Well, one in particular caught my attention. There was a guy who flew A-10 attack jets in either the Air Force Reserve or the Air National Guard, and he was also a television reporter. And I thought, a reporter who also flies in the military. Heck, if he can do that, I can do that too.
Wow.
So I decided to join the Air National Guard, became a flight engineer on C-130s, and spent most of my career on the C-130 Hercules. Spent the last 8 years on the C-5 Galaxy.
Wow. And so kind of circling back to kind of the family's impression. So it was late, but did they recognize kind of this dual interest that you have always had and supported, or did it take some, kind of talking into?
It took a while for them to get used to it because I was pretty well established in a journalism career. And I think to my parents, it probably came as a bolt out of the blue when I joined the Air National Guard.
Yeah.
But they got used to the idea. And that also led me to a different civilian career. I now work as an airline pilot.
Great. And were you able to make it a two-way street, meaning that kind of the Air National Guard could take advantage of some of the talents that you had from a journalism standpoint or reporting? Were you able to do any work that leveraged kind of, that career that you had built?
Yes, absolutely. In any military unit of any kind, if they find out you can write, you become the clerk typist, whether you like it or not. And actually, I did like it. Anytime anyone had anything to write, whether it was, a commendation to accompany the award of a medal, whether it was helping a squadron mate apply for a loan, whether it was any kind of briefing material, they knew I was a professional writer, so they often called on me to help them write those things, and I was happy to do it. And another way, it was a two-way street. Although I eventually got out of daily journalism, I left the Associated Press, I never did stop writing. And my military experience helped inspire ideas for some novels. And I was fortunate enough to get some military-related novels published. And I'm still doing that. In fact, as we speak, I'm working on a World War II novel.
Wow. So interesting. So can you put us kind of in context time-wise, when you joined, kind of what your initial point of entry was for signing up, just, given what was happening in the war, just kind of that backdrop?
I enlisted in December of 92, and by then the first Gulf War was over. And went to basic in 93. And that's a time frame where we were getting involved in places like Somalia. A lot of people are familiar with the film Black Hawk Down. I was not there at that time, but this is what was going on when I was beginning my military career. Yeah. Also, that's when you began seeing the former Yugoslavia fall apart and descend into violence. And in that time frame, you had the wars in Bosnia and Kosovo and so forth. And so some of the first real world missions that I flew in the 90s were into places like Bosnia and Kosovo.
Wow.
And then later, of course, along comes 9/11 in 2001, and that just changed everything. And then we had the war in Afghanistan, and then in 2003, the war in Iraq began. And that was sort of the height of my military career. By that time, I was a pretty experienced flight engineer, and I was a senior NCO. And of course, we got activated and deployed for Afghanistan and Iraq. Right after the war in Iraq started, I spent, I believe it was a year and a half on active duty before I went back to my civilian job, which by then was flying for an airline.
Yep. Got it. Maybe we can, just kind of start touch briefly on kind of basic. Can you tell us kind of in kind of those early days of your career, what were some vivid memories, first impressions? Maybe what were some of the best parts or worst parts of kind of ramping up that the military career?
Hmm. Uh, Training was a lot of fun, especially training as a flight engineer and the flying that I did in the C-130. And you're going to think this is a strange thing to say, but I even thought survival school was a lot of fun. All flyers have to go through survival school. I had grown up on a farm. I'd grown up in the outdoors, hunting and fishing. So for me, survival school, up in the hills of Washington State. Let's see, it was in the Colville National Forest. I loved it.
Wow.
I mean, people pay to have those kinds of experiences, and here I am, in this beautiful terrain, living in the woods for several days. I really enjoyed that.
Great. And obviously, I mean, the military is so diverse. Can you talk about just maybe, some of the people or, that were in your kind of early years that, possibly you would have met, had it not been, for this?
I made many
people that you were able to serve with.
I made many great friends in the military, and I'm still in touch with a lot of them. The bonds you form in the military, especially when you're under fire, and eventually we were, are just unbreakable. Many great friends. And as you say, a lot of people I wouldn't have met otherwise, because you meet people from such a wide variety of backgrounds. And I had a lot of great mentors in the military who taught me things about flying, for one thing, and about leadership and crew dynamics and that sort of thing. And I can remember some good lines from some of them. I remember one instructor in particular gave me a lesson about modern aircraft that has served me well. He said, "Just remember, the job of automation is to try to kill you, and it's your job not to let the automation kill you." I had another instructor who had a saying about aviation, but you can apply it to life in general. He said, "Things you would think would never happen will happen."
Yeah.
And I just remember good lines like that from some of the instructors. I had a chief flight engineer with the Maryland Air National Guard, a gentleman named Chief Master Sergeant Fred Williams. Sadly, he's no longer with us, but he was like a father figure to the whole unit.
Mm-hmm.
He was a wealth of knowledge about flying and about the C-130 Hercules. He was absolutely unflappable. He was this marvelous leadership presence in the unit. And he made such an impression on me that I dedicated one of my novels to him.
Wow. Wow. I'd love to spend a little bit time talking about kind of your wartime service. I'd love to kind of just understand maybe more specifically about some of the missions you're on. How did you kind of keep in touch with family back home, if you were allowed to do so during those probably very stressful times for you and for your family? And maybe, just any particular usual or unusual events that would be worth talking about. And I know it sounds like you obviously have a couple different deployments, but would love to hear about, as many as you can share.
Sure. Well, most of my wartime flying was in the C-130. The C-130's role is what we call tactical airlift, which is flying loads of cargo or personnel in and out of the theater of operations. Now, this is as opposed to strategic airlift, and this is what the C-5 does. Its role is to take very large loads of cargo from the continental U.S. all the way over to the theater of operations, and then fly all the way back. Well, that's what we did in the latter part of my career when I was in the C-5. The role of the C-130 tactical airlift is to take that cargo once it's in the theater and distribute it wherever it needs to go. So my first deployment after 9/11 was to Doha in Qatar. And from there, we were flying cargo and personnel in and out of Afghanistan and other locations, places like Pakistan, Kyrgyzstan, and so forth. And it was just from a technical, professional point of view, it was fascinating actually to do some of the things we had trained on that prior to 9/11, I thought we'd never do. I mean, we practiced and practiced and practiced flying low level, which is a defensive tactic that makes you a more difficult target for bad guys with shoulder launched missiles. Practiced and practiced that in the hills of West Virginia and Pennsylvania. And now here we are doing it in Afghanistan. In those days, our unit had a terrific wing commander. His name was Colonel Jesse Thomas. And he set the bar really high. He said, basically, you're going to be qualified and proficient at anything this airplane can do. So he made sure we were all trained and current on airdrop, night vision goggles, all that kind of thing. That Air National Guard unit was not a flying club by any means. Colonel Thomas made sure it was a combat-ready unit. So when 9/11 came along and we had to do that job for real, we were ready. And he had us fly on night vision goggles until it became second nature. Now suddenly we're flying in hostile areas in Afghanistan where that's necessary. And by the time we got there and had to do that, it just sort of felt natural because we had practiced so much. There's an old saying in the military: the more you sweat in peace, the less you bleed in war. And that was really the truth. So it was gratifying to go into the job and to feel like we were ready for it.
Yeah.
And then the same experience happened when we began flying into Iraq. I remember the first night that I was with the crew flying into Iraq. We went in flying at very low level on night vision goggles, doing what we were trained to do.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, keep going.
We did have some pretty hair-raising experiences. There were times when we came under fire. Luckily, I was never in an aircraft that was hit by any fire, but it wasn't because the bad guys weren't trying. I remember one night very early in the Iraq War, I think this was in May of 2003, we were taking off from Baghdad one night. And very shortly after takeoff, about the time we got the landing gear up, three things happened all at once in much less time than it takes to tell it. One thing, the missile warning tones went off, which is this gosh awful screeching sound in the cockpit. Our aircraft commander, the pilot in the left seat, terrific pilot, a gentleman named Mike Langley, racked the airplane into a hard turn. So now we're pulling a couple of G's. And the defensive flares fired. And at night, they're incredibly bright, and it just lit up the flight deck like the sun. And for an instant, I thought, it's all over, we've had it. And then I realized I didn't feel any impact. And the airplane was still flying, and we just went into the normal calls and procedures we did when we realized what had happened was insurgents on the ground had fired a shoulder-fired missile at us. From my seat, I did not see the missile, but the co-pilot saw it, and one of the loadmasters said he saw it, and they thought it missed us by about 300 feet. So that was the closest call. That was the closest call that I had. It wasn't the only time we came under fire, though. And I'll tell you a funny story about myself. I laugh at myself when I recall this. Many of the nights when we were flying in and out of Iraq, you'd be flying along on your night vision goggles, and you might see, say, a burst of tracer fire come up at your 11 o'clock maybe a quarter mile away, and you'd call it out, tracers 11 o'clock, no factor, but you wouldn't take any evasive action because it wouldn't be close enough to make you feel threatened. And then the next night you're flying along and you see a burst of triple of any aircraft artillery, off your left wing, say, and you call that out. But again, not take any evasive action because it wasn't that close. And then another night you might see a rocket propelled grenade come up several hundred, or rather maybe several thousand yards away. And I found myself thinking, there's nothing there. What are those knuckleheads shooting at?
Yeah.
And then it finally dawned on me, we're flying blacked out on night vision goggles. All our lights are off. They can't see us, but they can hear us. And they were firing up at the noise of the engine. So what those knuckleheads were shooting at was us, just not very accurately. Thank goodness.
Like that one. I'd love to, there was a quote that you said, kind of like, some of the things that you never think are going to happen are going to happen. And obviously, probably a lot of your preparation and then what was happening in the war in the world was probably different than anyone could have ever imagined, right? So I'm wondering if there were some things which you saw just changed immediately because the kind of the input of the enemy or the war. And so, for example, I'll give you context. We interviewed a person from the Navy not too long ago, who said kind of post USS Cole, Navy trained its members to shoot more. But, because when those barges came up to the ship, it was assumed it would be a friendly, trash collector, not somebody who was going to. And so all of kind of the folks on the edge didn't know how to shoot so much, or wasn't a core part of the training. And kind of post that was very much part of the training. So I'm wondering whether there's for anything kind of with the input of Iraq, Afghanistan, that you kind of saw evolve given just the complexity of the situations that you were fighting in, or that our country was, dealing with.
Oh, that's a good question. I don't recall a big cultural change to the unit. As I mentioned, I spent most of my time with the West Virginia Air National Guard, and I can tell you those West Virginia guys and gals, they know how to shoot. They're serious about their jobs. So there was not a culture change with regard to that. One thing that occurs to me is that in the 90s, when I first joined, there were still some Vietnam veterans in the units, and you would hear their stories and be wowed by some of them and be amazed by some of their courage and ingenuity and things like that. And I never thought I would be in a position to understand through my own experience some of what they went through. And then, along comes Iraq and Afghanistan, by which time most of them were retired. And I found myself really putting into play some of the lessons and advice from them. I'll give you an example. When I first joined the Maryland Air National Guard, there were a number of Vietnam veterans in the unit at the time. And one gentleman was a fellow flight engineer on C-130s, but he had been a Marine Corps helicopter crew chief in Vietnam, and he had been shot down twice. And one of the things he said to me is that, heaven forbid, if you ever get shot down, one of the things you're going to find very useful is a good, strong knife. I advise you to put a boot knife in your boot and wear that whenever you fly.
Wow.
I flew 5,000 hours in the military, and for every one of them, I had a boot knife. Fortunately, I never needed to use it for anything more dramatic than chipping ice and cutting pizza, but I took his advice and made sure I was so equipped.
Yeah. Wow. That's great. I would love to talk a little bit just about kind of where you were for 9/11 and how kind of that impacted your service.
Oh, yes. On 9/11, I was driving up to my unit in Martinsburg. I was flying as an airline pilot by then. I was off that day from the airline, and I was scheduled to fly a local training sortie with my unit. So I got up early in the morning, and I'm driving up to Martinsburg through the beautiful country roads. And I had listened to the news on National Public Radio at 9 a.m., I think it was. And I punched away from the news station and started listening to a country music station. It was some small station, not a Washington, D.C. station. And the announcer broke in and he said, we have reports of an airplane flying into one of the towers of the World Trade Center. Well, having worked in the news business, I was familiar with how pranksters and hoaxers were all the time calling newsrooms and trying to get reporters to bite off on a false story. And my first thought was, it's a bluebird clear day all up and down the East Coast. A plane hasn't flown into the World Trade Center. This little radio station got taken in by a hoax. So I punched back to the news station, and they were reporting the same thing. And then I thought, oh, Lord, this is real. And so I continued to listen to the news as I drove to the unit. And of course, by then, there came word of the second aircraft hitting the second tower. By the time I got to the base, it had gone into what we call threat condition Delta, which was the highest level of alert and readiness. And in what is now a familiar story, all our flying at that unit that day got canceled. Of course, the airlines were grounded. You've heard that story. And we spent much of the morning watching the news on television, horrified. And then came word that an aircraft had hit the Pentagon. That was home territory for us. Martinsburg is not far from Washington, D.C. And at the time, I lived in Alexandria, Virginia. I still do, right outside D.C. As a matter of fact, my wife has always been a defense contractor. At that time, her office was not in the Pentagon, but she often went to meetings at the Pentagon. And the room that she used whenever she went to meetings at the Pentagon was destroyed on 9/11. So thank God she wasn't there that day. So this was personal to us in this Martinsburg unit. We didn't know exactly what we were going to be doing, but we knew we were going to be getting busy doing something pretty quick. Yeah. And as I mentioned, those West Virginia folks take their military jobs very seriously. At the time, our unit had 12 C-130s. Most of them were on the ramp that day. A couple of them were out on missions, but I think 9 or 10 of the 12 aircraft were on the ramp. Maintenance swung into action, did the maintenance pre-flights on all the aircraft, fueled them, got them all ready. Then they turned them over to operations. And those of us in operations went out and did our operations pre-flight checks and so forth. By the end of the day, every one of those aircraft was, as we say, locked, cocked, and ready to rock. And very soon after, we got busy flying Afghanistan-related missions.
Wow. Wow. What an intense kind of front row seat to that.
Oh, yes. And we had members of our unit who had front row seats in other ways as well, in some cases through their civilian jobs. For example, one of our loadmasters on our C-130s at the time worked as an EMT in Arlington, Virginia, I believe it was. He was one of the first responders at the Pentagon. Many of our pilots, of course, were airline pilots, and one in particular was stuck on a taxiway in a long line of planes at Newark when all the flying got grounded. Yeah. And he can look out his window of his 727 at Newark and watch the Twin Towers burning. Another of our members in our unit lived in the Shanksville, Pennsylvania area. very close to where United 93 went down. And because of his familiarity with the local area, he was asked to help the FBI investigate. So he was involved in that. So a lot of our people were personally involved in 9/11 in a lot of ways, even beyond our normal military jobs.
Yeah. Not only obviously to be a pilot and wrap your head around the scale of and significance, but then also to be a commercial pilot at the same time, and know that the whole country has been grounded. That is still just unbelievable, right? To go back and think of that moment of, it's
that was a strange time, and in some ways an eerie time in a lot of ways. If I recall correctly, 9/11 was on a Tuesday.
Yeah.
Civilian aviation was grounded until the following Thursday. I went back to my civilian job. I did my first civilian flight that Thursday night, and I was flying for a commuter airline at the time. I was based at Dulles International Airport, and I was scheduled to do a flight from Dulles to Roanoke, Virginia. And even though the airlines had been given the green light to return to flying, they had still canceled a lot of flights. Planes were out of position. Passengers were canceling their flights because they were understandably afraid to fly, because we didn't know if there would be more attempted hijackings and so forth. And I can remember being out on the ramp at Dulles doing a pre-flight inspection on my airplane, and it was silent. It was just so strange to be on the ramp at Dulles, which is normally a very noisy place, and not hear an engine turning anywhere. You could hear birds chirping. It was bizarre. And we flew our flight from Dulles to Roanoke with no passengers. All the passengers decided not to show up, and we flew to Roanoke just to position the aircraft to Roanoke for the flight back to Dulles the next day. Well, there were no passengers on that either.
Oh my goodness.
I think for the first 4 or 5 flights that I did after 9/11, we were empty except for crew, just positioning the plane in case the people who had bought the tickets wanted to show up.
Oh, wow.
And in those first several days, there was so little traffic on the air that you wouldn't hear a lot of radio calls. And every now and then you might hear a pilot, and I did this too, you might hear a pilot just say to air traffic control, hey, center radio check, you're still there. Just making sure you hadn't lost the radio because you weren't hearing anybody else talking.
Yeah. Wow, it's surreal, isn't it? Really. Yeah. Wow. Maybe let's now shift just kind of to I'd say the kind of back half of your kind of military service. Would love to hear any, highlights, your deployments, and then have you kind of walk through your leading as well.
Well, the last deployment I did was in 2012, and that was in the C-5 Galaxy, and that was a pretty interesting mission. As I mentioned earlier, the C-5 is a strategic airlifter, and normally its role is to fly large loads of cargo all the way from the continental U.S., all the way over to the theater of operations, and then come all the way back home to the U.S. But in 2012, we did something that was unusual for the C-5. I won't necessarily say it was the only time the C-5 has ever deployed, but it was certainly the only time I ever deployed in it. And I do know it was very unusual. What was happening was the 82nd Aviation Brigade of the Army, if I'm getting my terminology right, which is a helicopter unit, obviously, was swapping out with the 101st. So one unit was coming out of Afghanistan, and they needed to take their helicopters out because they had been flying those helicopters in Afghanistan so long, they needed major maintenance. And then the unit replacing them was coming back in with their helicopters. So a bunch of helicopters had to come out of Afghanistan. A bunch of helicopters had to go into Afghanistan. So the big picture mission was what we called multimodal transportation to move those helicopters. So the helicopters were put on ships, the inbound helicopters were put on ships in the U.S. and sent to Rota Naval Station in Spain. From there, they were loaded on our C-5s, and we flew them from Rota Naval Air Station in Spain all the way to Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan. Once in Bagram, we would stay overnight. Over the day. We were flying at night and trying to sleep during the day, which is another story. We would take the outbound helicopters, load them in the C-5s, and fly them back to Rota. And then once at Rota, the outbound helicopters were put on ships to take them back to the U.S. And it began in August of 2012. And so in August, it's very hot in Afghanistan. At Bagram, the field elevation, if I recall correctly, is about 8,000 feet. So it's not a sea level airfield, and that affects aircraft performance. Basically, what this means is it was so hot that aircraft performance would have been so degraded during the day that it wouldn't have been safe to try to fly with heavy loads. So what we had to do was we had to wait until night when it would be cool enough for the aircraft to perform better. And then we would put on enough fuel to take off with helicopters and either meet a tanker at a rendezvous point and fuel in the air, or if for some reason you couldn't rendezvous with the tanker, we would divert to Incirlik Air Base in Turkey. So this really took a lot of clockwork and planning. Luckily, the crew that I was with never had to divert to Turkey. We were always able to join up with the tanker, fuel up in the air, and continue to load them. So this thing had so many moving parts, and it was kind of an honor to be a part of it. And here again, I'm going to brag on my unit, those West Virginia guys and gals. We never canceled the mission, and we got the helicopters moved ahead of schedule. And I do recall a briefing before we deployed for this. I remember our commander basically saying, this is a high visibility mission. A lot of people with a lot of rank are going to be looking at it. Do not screw this up.
Okay.
And I'm happy and proud to say that we didn't. And it was just a fascinating mission. And
yeah,
that was my last deployment. That was in 2012. I retired in 2013. So I felt like I reached near the end on a high note.
Yeah. And can you talk a little bit about kind of transition kind of back into, life without service and how that went for you?
Well, speaking of people who gave me good advice, one piece of good advice that I got when I retired from the military was someone who said, you're going to miss it. You're going to miss the people, and you're going to miss the camaraderie.
Yeah.
And he was exactly right. And he said, the best way to hang on to that, apart from keeping in touch with your buddies from your unit, which I still do, is to join the Veterans Organization. So I joined the VFW and the American Legion. My American Legion post is Post 20, based in Washington, D.C. at the National Press Club. And I have recently been elected commander of the post, and that's been quite an honor. We've got some great people in that post, a lot of Vietnam veterans. For some reason, it's a Navy-heavy post, but for some reason, they tolerate me as an old flyboy. And I just enjoy those people quite a bit. And it's a historic post. We trace our history back all the way to 1919. It's one of the oldest posts in the Legion, and the post was started by the famed World War I general John J. Blackjack Pershing. At the time, Pershing was an associate member of the National Press Club, and he was pretty media savvy for the media of that day. And he was very busy at that time founding the American Legion. And he realized, hey, maybe a good way to get the word out about the Legion is to have a Legion post in the press club where there were all these World War I veterans who were working in the media at that time.
Wow.
The post has been going ever since then.
Wow.
So,
and was Pershing a journalist, or it was just he thought that was an interesting vehicle? What was I'd like to hear a little bit more about kind of that connection.
That's an interesting question, and to be honest, I can answer it only with speculation. I'm not sure exactly why Pershing was an associate member of the club.
Yeah.
I'm certainly glad that he was. I do know that during World War One, he helped bring back the newspaper Stars and Stripes. That had been published during the Civil War, if I'm not mistaken. And he brought it back because he felt it would be a good tool for having soldiers keep up with the news, keep up with what was going on. Well, if he helped bring back Stars and Stripes, technically that makes him a newspaper publisher.
Yeah.
So fits right in with the National Press Club.
Yeah, that makes sense. And can you tell me about kind of some of the goals that you have now in this new position? And congratulations, by the way. That's exciting to be with, I think, such a high profile and historic club. But what are some of the priorities? I mean, you've got obviously this whole new generation of veterans who've had some pretty amazing experience kind of coming out of Afghanistan. And obviously we're still living in a time where there's some World War II. There's, a lot of Vietnam where that's getting older. It seems like you're straddling, quite a big range of experiences.
Well, one of my goals, frankly, is just to continue the good work of some of the previous commanders. This post has been led by some really terrific commanders, and those are big shoes to fill. And I hope to do as close as I can to as good a job as they did. Like any other organization, we have to change with the times. Just recently, we've created our own website. One of the challenges that we have is reaching out to younger members of the military, and they don't have to have retired to join the American Legion. I mean, we can take a 20-year-old who's serving in the military.
Got it.
But now we're competing with so many other things for people's time. We'd love to have the 20-year-old who's in the military, but he's busy with his job. If he's in the Guard and Reserve, he's busy with that and his civilian job. Plus, there are so many other good veterans organizations to choose from now. So, for example, there's Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America. I happen to be a member of that group too.
Sure.
There's, of course, the VFW. There's other organizations. There's the Reserve Organization of America. There's a lot of great veterans organizations out there. And, the 20-year-old private is not going to join all of them. So that's part of the issue when it comes to recruiting new members. And I wouldn't take away anything from the other veteran service organizations because they all do wonderful work. And I know people who are in leadership with some of those organizations, and they do wonderful, wonderful work. But again, reaching out to new members is a priority and one of our biggest challenges nowadays.
Yeah. I guess you've got obviously a lot of ways to reach them through social media to kind of let them know your activities, but that also means that everybody else is using the same channels and this as you said, competing interests. In your experience and kind of I guess in post 20, do you find that a lot of the veterans come kind of and have an affinity for people who have the exact same kind of I'd say service, meaning the Afghanistan vets typically like to spend time with Afghanistan vets, or are you seeing that there's a lot of cross-pollination? What are some of the kind of I'd say experiences that you see in the membership?
I would say there's a lot of cross-pollination in anytime I see any group of veterans get together. It's not like the Afghanistan veterans all hang together, and then in the other corner there's Vietnam veterans. Everybody mixes and mingles. The Vietnam veterans in post 20 were quite welcoming to me. We see ourselves as all part of the same brotherhood and sisterhood. So there's really not any cliquishness based on the time in which you served.
Yep. I think maybe I'd just like to move this last part of the interview just kind of on any kind of lessons that we've talked about a lot of the amazing mentors that you've had. Now you're in a leadership position, certainly with Post 20, but are there kind of any messages that you would like, younger folks in the service to hear, kind of just some of the bigger life lessons that your military service has impacted on you?
Train like you fight. Remember the old expression, the more you sweat in peace, the less you bleed in war. If you've studied and prepared before you get into a hostile fire situation, you're going to be much better off. I remember our commander with the West Virginia Guard, Colonel Thomas, talking about his philosophy of command. He said, if you get into a combat zone, there's going to be enough stress on you just being in a combat zone. You don't need the additional stress of having to learn a piece of equipment that you're not adequately familiar with. You don't need the additional stress of learning new tactics and procedures. If all of that is second nature, then you'll be under a lot less stress when you get there. And his words turned out to be true. So that's something I would pass along to younger people in the military. Or to put it another way, anytime you're goofing off, your enemy is training to kick your butt.
Wow. Yeah.
So study and train and be ready when the time comes, because sad to say, war is part of the human condition, and if you stay in the military long enough, your time's going to come. You'll be asked to do your job for real.